On a cold January night in 1999, Joyce Chiang left her office at the Immigration and Naturalization Service in Washington, D.C. She was 28 years old, brilliant, and had just been promoted, but Joyce would never make it home. What happened next would be covered up as a suicide until years later, when a prison guard made a phone call he didn't know was being recorded. And what he said changed everything investigators thought they knew about Joyce's death. Joyce Chiang was the kind of person who made you believe in the American dream. Born in Taiwan, she'd come to the United States when she was just a child, and so naturally she threw herself into becoming everything her parents had sacrificed for. At Northwestern University, she didn't just study. She excelled, earning both her bachelor's and law degree. Her younger brother Roger would later say, she had this way of making everyone around her want to be better, to work harder, to dream bigger. By January 1999, Joyce had landed her dream job as an attorney at the INS in Washington, D.C. She loved the work helping immigrants navigate the complex legal system, being the advocate she wished her own family had when they first arrived. Her supervisor would later describe her as brilliant but humble, the type who stayed late not for recognition, but because she genuinely cared about every case that crossed her desk. On the evening of January 9th, Joyce was working on a particularly complex asylum case. She'd told her roommate that morning she'd probably be home late. There was a family from El Salvador whose petition needed to be perfect. "These people have been through enough," she'd said over coffee. "The least I can do is make sure the paperwork doesn't fail them." Therefore, at 7:30 p.m., Joyce finally closed the file, satisfied she'd done everything possible. She bundled up in her black peacoat, the one her mother had bought her for Christmas just 2 weeks earlier, and grabbed her keys. The security guard at the front desk, Marcus Williams, would later remember waving goodnight to her. She looked tired, he'd recall, but she smiled and said, "See you Monday, Marcus." Joyce's apartment was in DuPont Circle, about 3 miles from her office. She usually took the metro, but that night she decided to walk partway. She'd been sitting all day and needed to clear her head. The temperature was around 35 degrees, cold, but not unbearable for someone used to Chicago winters. At 7:45 p.m., she called her friend Christine from her Nokia flip phone. They chatted about weekend plans, maybe dim sum in Chinatown. Definitely studying for the Virginia bar exam Joyce planned to take that summer. She wanted to be licensed in multiple states, Christine would later tell investigators. She had all these plans. The last confirmed sighting of Joyce Chiang alive was at 8:14 p.m., captured on a security camera at a Starbucks on Connecticut Avenue. She bought a small coffee, black, and left heading south toward the DuPont Circle metro station. She never made it. By 10:30 p.m., Joyce's roommate Sarah was starting to worry. Joyce always called if she was going to be later than expected. It was just how she was, considerate to a fault. Therefore, Sarah tried Joyce's cell phone. Straight to voicemail. She called the office, no answer. But it wasn't until the next morning, when Joyce's bed remained untouched and her car was still in the office garage, that real panic set in. Joyce's younger brother Roger got the call at 7 a.m. "She's probably just stayed at a friend's place," he told Sarah, but even as he said it, he knew something was wrong. Joyce didn't do spontaneous. Joyce planned everything. The police initially weren't concerned. A 28-year-old woman not coming home for one night didn't exactly scream emergency. But Joyce's family knew better, and so they started their own search. Roger printed hundreds of flyers with Joyce's photo, the one from her INS badge, where she's smiling, looking every bit the dedicated public servant she was. On January 11th, 2 days after Joyce vanished, a jogger along the Anacostia River noticed something strange. A black peacoat, neatly folded, sitting on the riverbank. No signs of struggle. No footprints leading to the water, just a coat, placed there as deliberately as someone might set down a book they planned to return to. Inside the coat pocket was an INS identification badge. Joyce Chiang's face smiled up from the plastic card. But here's where things get strange. The coat was completely dry. It hadn't been there during the previous day's search of that exact area. Someone had placed Joyce's coat by the river after she disappeared. But why? And more disturbing, where was Joyce? The discovery of the coat changed everything. Therefore, the police finally launched a full investigation. The initial police theory was tragically simple: suicide. Young professional, probably overwhelmed by work stress, walks to the river and jumps in. Case closed. But Joyce's family and friends knew this was impossible. She had just gotten promoted, Roger told detectives. She was studying for another bar exam. You don't make plans for the future and then... He couldn't finish the sentence. And so the inconsistencies started piling up. First, there was the location of the coat. The spot where it was found was over 4 miles from where Joyce was last seen, in the opposite direction from her apartment. Security footage from that night showed no signs of Joyce anywhere near the Anacostia River. How did her coat end up there? But that wasn't even the strangest part. When investigators checked Joyce's credit cards, they found something that made no sense. 3 charges appeared on her visa after she vanished. One at a convenience store in Southeast D.C., one at a gas station in Maryland, and one at a motel near the Virginia border. The purchases totaled less than $100 cigarettes, snacks, a room for one night. Joyce didn't smoke. She didn't even own a car to need gas. And she certainly had no reason to be at a motel 30 miles from home. Here's what made investigators' skin crawl. The motel's registration log showed the room had been paid for with Joyce's credit card, but the signature wasn't even close to hers. Security footage from the motel had mysteriously been erased, a technical malfunction, the manager claimed. But a night clerk remembered seeing someone check in with Joyce's card. It wasn't an Asian woman, he told police. It was a man, white guy, maybe 40s. He seemed nervous. Therefore, investigators now believed Joyce hadn't committed suicide, she'd been murdered, and someone was using her cards to throw them off track. On April 1st, 1999, nearly 3 months after Joyce vanished, Kay Acres on the Anacostia River made a horrific discovery. Human remains had washed up on the shoreline, badly decomposed, but still wearing fragments of professional clothing. Dental records confirmed what everyone feared but needed to know. They had found Joyce Chiang. But the medical examiner's findings raised even more questions. The condition of the body was inconsistent with someone who had been in the water since January. The level of decomposition suggested she'd been dead for weeks, not months. Where had her body been all that time? Roger Chiang refused to accept the official ruling. My sister was murdered, he told reporters, and someone in a position of power is covering it up. He had no idea how right he was. The case went cold for 5 years. Joyce's death was officially listed as undetermined cause, though police privately maintained their suicide theory. Her family held memorials, hired private investigators, and pushed for justice that seemed increasingly unlikely to come. And then, in 2004, something happened that nobody could have predicted. In September 2004, a federal prison guard named Walter Bishop was arrested on unrelated corruption charges, taking bribes to smuggle contraband into the D.C. correctional facility. As part of their investigation, federal agents have been monitoring and recording all of Bishop's phone calls for months, and so naturally, when they reviewed the recordings, they expected to find evidence of his smuggling operation. What they found instead made their blood run cold. On one recording from July 2004, Bishop was talking to another corrections officer about that Chinese girl from '99. The investigators initially thought nothing of it, until Bishop said something that made them rewind the tape. You know they never found out about the van. Thank fucking God. Can you imagine if they'd traced it back to the other man cut him off? Not on the phone, Walter, but Walter Bishop, probably drunk and definitely arrogant, kept talking. She wasn't supposed to die. Just scare her a little. Make her drop that case. But Martinez got carried away. You know how he gets. The static on the recording crackled like electricity, Bishop's voice slurring with each word. Time seemed to slow as the investigators listened. 5 seconds of audio that would unravel 5 years of lies. The federal agent's hands trembled slightly as he marked the timestamp, 11:47 p.m. The investigators immediately cross-referenced. Joyce Chiang, Chinese-American woman, died in 1999. working on immigration cases. One name kept appearing in her final case files: Carlos Martinez, an El Salvadoran national fighting deportation who had connections to MS-13. Joyce had been building a bulletproof case against her. The full picture was staggering. Prison guards had been taking money from gang members to intimidate witnesses and lawyers working on deportation cases. Joyce had been targeted because she wouldn't back down. On that January night, they'd grabbed her off the street, thrown her in a van, and things had gone catastrophically wrong. Bishop's drunken confession continued. We dumped the body way out in Virginia, waited months before moving it to the river. Made it look like suicide. The recording captured everything: names, dates, locations, 5 prison guards, 3 gang members, 1 brilliant young lawyer who'd stood in their way. Joyce Chiang hadn't walked to that river. She'd been murdered for doing her job. The recordings led to the largest corruption investigation in D.C. corrections history. Walter Bishop was convicted not just of smuggling, but of conspiracy to commit murder. He received life without parole. 4 other guards made plea deals, revealing a network of corruption that had operated for years, targeting immigration lawyers who wouldn't play ball. Carlos Martinez was already serving life for another murder by the time the truth came out. He was never charged, and Joyce's death prosecutors said there wasn't enough physical evidence. Despite Bishop's recorded confession, Roger Chiang finally had answers, but they brought little comfort. She died because she was good at her job, he said at a press conference, his voice cracking. Our parents came here believing in justice, in the American system. Joyce died defending that same system they believed in. The Starbucks where Joyce bought her last coffee now has a small plaque by the door. Most customers don't notice it, but for those who do, it reads, "In memory of Joyce Chiang, 1907 to 1999. She stood for justice. Her case files from that night, including the Martinez deportation case, were mysteriously destroyed in a fire at an INS storage facility 2 weeks after her death. The security footage from the street she walked that night had been erased. Even now, investigators believe there are people who know more about Joyce's final hours. People who will never talk,